Hey guys, it's Wes here. I am back with another episode of My Flock where I document my journey to becoming a better poker player and pursuing a lifelong dream of one day, maybe, turning into a professional poker player. And this episode, we are going to dig into some hands that I played, some interesting spots over the last week in the lower limits online. Now, there are some very interesting spots that I want to show you guys, and I'm going to talk you guys through it. So, as it's freaking cold out here, it's time to bring the heat. Let's go, team. Alright guys, let's get started straight away. We are going to take a look at my 5 favorite hands of this week. I haven't played as much as I wanted to, but I still want to share these spots with you guys. It is just going to be purely for entertainment. I am going to give you a little bit of a breakdown of my thoughts, but the focus is not so much on strategy, just showing you guys what's happening at these crazy micro stakes. We are currently playing 10 cents, 25 cents, and we are going to take a look at my hands through a software that is called Poker Tracker. Poker Tracker helps you to register your hands, and that's what I use to look back at my hands, kind of review them, and see where I can learn. But it's also going to be a great piece of software for this vlog. So let's get started. The first hand that we have is this hand where I have kings. The under the gun player is going to be acting first, and that is the player after the blinds. And so we see that he raises to about 2.5 times the blinds. Now from here, what we're going to do is think about our decision with kings. We are the middle position player, or as they sometimes call it as well, the hijack. And in this position with kings, we have a very strong hand. So we go ahead and we want to isolate. We want to play heads up against this recreational player that also has almost $50 behind. So that's a lot for these stakes. We go ahead and we 3-bet to $2. And then from there, we're going to see that everybody folds up until the point that we get to the big blind. And the big blind, as you can see, is not sitting with a full stack. He's not playing with $25. He's playing with $17 and some change. And then he decides to also call. The original player, the under the gun player, now also decides that he wants to stay in the hand and he is going to call us as well. So we are going to be going 3-way to the flop with 2 recreational players. This flop is obviously not amazing. It's not what I was looking for as we go to a 3-way spot in a 3-bet pot. It has all the diamonds. I don't have a diamond. It has also an ace, so 1 overcard to my kings. And 3-way, we are probably going to slow down here a little bit, but let's see what the actions are before us. So we see that the big blind decides to check. The under the gun player, that was the original raiser, decides to do the same thing. And then it comes to us. We can either check or bet here. And since it's a pretty wet board, as we say, there's a lot of changes that can happen. And there's an overcard. And we're 3-way to this flop. We are just going to check behind. So that's what we do. And on the turn, we see the king of diamonds. Well, great card. Or is it? We can clearly see now if one of the players would have a diamond in their hands, they would have a flush. So we are not going to go crazy on this turn card. But let's see what the big blind does. He checks. The under the gun player decides to do the same thing. And then when it gets to us, well, we definitely have a lot of hands beat here. But since both players can also have a flush and that beats our 3 of a kind kings, we are now deciding that the strength of our hand isn't as great as it was pre-flop, and we're just going to check and see the river. When we do, we see the ace of spades. This is obviously a good card for us because now we have a full house, and also look at what the big blind does. He decides to bet out. This is obviously a good sign because right now with our full house, we beat all the flushes. We also beat some other full houses, and some players might even bet some, for example, ace hand where they now have 3 of a kind aces and they just want to get some value. But what's great is that the under the gun player decides to call, and now it's up to us. We can either call or raise this bet, and we got to make a decision. So I remember in this specific spot, I thought about it for a little while, but since we're up against two recreational players, I don't see them folding flushes all the times when I go all in. I also don't see them folding worse full houses. We are just going to put everything in the middle. So we started this hand with about $50. We still have two players in the hand, and we're just going to go for max value. And the big blind decides that, you know what, this hand is not for me. But the under the gun player, I remember him thinking for a little while. He thinks, and then I think he types in the chat, I'm such a bad player, I can't fold this hand, which I thought was very, very funny. And he goes ahead and he makes the call. We can't really blame him because he also had a full house. So I'm happy that I made it very, very large. And yes, we shipped this spot with our kings over aces. So that is our first hand. All right, team, time for hand number 2 that I want to show you guys. I promise you it is going to be another fun hand played at these lower limits. When you play at these lower limits, you are going to face a lot of recreational players, and recreational players, they just play for fun. Hence the reason they're playing on lower limits most of the time. But what we're also going to see is that they don't necessarily have a solid strategy. Therefore, we want to try and play as many hands as possible that we can against them, because that is typically where the money comes from. So we are going to see that in this hand as well. The under the gun player here decides to raise it up. He is our recreational player, and it gets folded to us in the cutoff. Now, from the cutoff, I don't always raise ace-9 of diamonds, or re-raise ace-9 of diamonds, I should say. But since we're playing against this recreational player, I want to try and get him heads up. I've seen him make a lot of mistakes at the table so far, so we decide to go for it and place the 3-bet. We make it $2.25, about 3 times his size, and we are going to get called by him. He decides to take it to the flop and immediately check. Now, the first thing that goes through our mind is that we don't have a mate hand yet, but we have some great potential with our hand. We have the nut flush draw, as they call it, the strongest flush draw out there. We also have a overcard to the king that's on the board, and we can fold out a lot of weaker hands, and that is the reason I'm going to place a c-bet or a continuation bet. These continuation bets are meant to sometimes just take the pot down straight away or continue building a bigger pot, and in this case we can do both. So I decide to bet, he decides to call, and we're going to take it to the turn. Now the turn is the jack, or the jackaroonie as some people call it. But what we're going to see is he decides to check again, and the action is on us. This card does not necessarily improve our range of hands that we could potentially have, but we are going to probably have more jacks in our range than he does. And I think also that by him checking twice here, we are going to be ahead of his hands a lot of the times if we had a very strong hand. Now this time I can see him calling my flop bet with something like an 8 still. There's going to be some kings in his range. There's also going to be some flush draws or other draws in his range. And he can have a pair like 9s or 10s. And therefore, I'm going to go ahead and I decide to see if we can make him fold some of these hands with the jack. I decide to bet bigger this time, about 75% of the pot. And he decides to make the call again. So when he makes this call, I think he is probably going to have a stronger hand than I initially thought. If he calls on 2 streets, he must have something. Although he can still have some of those draws, it's going to be a little tougher. So we're going to see what happens on this river. Well, I promise you guys, none of these hands are, or not all of these hands are just going to be great fucking hands. We are also going to show you guys some things where we do it wrong. But what I really like to see here is that we rivered the nut flush. So now we have the absolute best hand, and he decides to check again. Now this time, by the way we have put our bets in, we are only left with $15 that we're going to bet in a $20 pot. And so we only have one option, that is either to check behind or go all in. But like I said, it's really only one option, and we decide to just rip it in and bet everything. Now, when we bet everything, I think he still has to call sometimes with some of his top pair hands. He can also still decide to make a hero call with some of his lower paired hands, but we are going to see what he decides to do. And yes, you are right. I wouldn't have placed his hand in my flock if he did not make the call, and that he did. So he decides to call, and he had top pair and a pretty good kicker, and we got lucky on the river. Yes, guys, we move on, and it's time for hand number 3. In hand number 3, we are going to play a hand with ace queen of diamonds. Everybody folds to us, and with a hand so strong as ace queen of diamonds, we are obviously not going to sit around and fold this hand. We decide to raise it. So we put in the raise and the small blind this time. I was fairly new at the table, didn't know much about him, but he decides to go ahead and place the 3-bet on us this time. Now, the big blind decides to fold, and the action is back on us. With a hand like ace queen of diamonds, it's just too strong. We really cannot fold it here, and it is also not strong enough to re-raise him. So, since we're playing in position, we are just going to decide to make the call. We call his raise, and the flop comes out queen high with a 7 of diamonds and a 3 of diamonds. Now, the small blind is not going to sit around. He decides to put out a bet that is just a little bit more than, I would say, 1/3 of the pot. Now, in this case, with the ace queen of diamonds, we are going nowhere, but we are facing a decision. Do we want to call, or do we want to raise? I am going to say that most often here with our top pairs, we would probably like to call. But for whatever reason, I can't remember anymore, we decide to go for it. Now, I think at the time, the queen of diamonds had something to do with it. It means that we are going to have a backdoor flush draw. And also, if he has a flush draw himself, we have one of his outs that he needs. So I decided to go ahead and raise that. I don't know necessarily how terrible that is. Again, I'm still learning, so just throwing that hand in there, but I think it was an interesting spot. He decides to place the call, and we go to the turn. Now, this time, the turn is the 3 of hearts, so doesn't really change anything on the hands. I don't think neither of us is going to have many 3s in his range. And yeah, the small blind decides to check. Now from here, the action is on us, and the pot, as you guys might see right now, is already $18.55, and we have about a pot size bet left. So I remember at the time, it wasn't an easy decision, but I decided to go for it here. I decided to put everything in. Now, the reason I did it at the time is I think if he continued with a hand like, for example, pocket jacks, tens, those kind of hands, or a hand like king, queen, for example, he is going to be in some trouble. He might also have some flush draws in there that we can now put some extra pressure on. And, well, he can still have some very, very strong hands as well. It is possible that he's going to have an overpair, like kings or aces. Since we have ace queen, it's less likely that he has a pair of aces, but it's still a possibility. And at the same time, we block a hand like queen, queen that has us beat as well. So we put it all in the middle, and this time we get called, and we are seeing a river that is the 4 of spades, which means we still have just top pair and a top kicker, but it also doesn't change the dynamics of the board too much, and none of the flush draws get there. So Philin now has to show his hand, and we see that he has king queen. So he had top pair and a good kicker, the second best kicker, but we had a better kicker, and therefore we also take this third pot. Oh yeah. Don't you worry. Yes, I am also going to lose you guys some losing hands, and this is going to be one. I'm still going to try and show you guys my thoughts as we go through this hand. We have ace jack under the gun, and we decide to raise it up. My standard raising size under the gun is 2.2 big blinds, and so that's what we make it. We raise it up to 55 cents. Now, everybody folds to the big blind, and the big blind was one of the worst players that I have seen in a long time. He made some ridiculous calls. He lost quite a lot of money. He kept buying himself in again, and he decides in the big blind to give it a call, and we're going to play heads up against him, which obviously we don't really mind. Now, when the flop comes out, jack 8-3, he can have a lot of hands here that have our hand beat, but most of the time we are probably going to be good. Also, given the fact that he is playing a lot of hands, he might also have some worst hands, and given the information that I just shared with you guys, I'm going to see him call a lot of worst hands here. So With all that information, I decide to really go for it, and I start to put in a very big bet. So I decide to make it a little bigger than the pot, and what we are going to see here is that he decides to make the call. Now, the turn card is a 3 of hearts. It's not completing any flushes. It's not really changing the board too much, or at least I thought so at that point. Now, he decides to put in the check, and since he just called this massive bet and he can still have a lot of worst hands, I decide to put in a very, very big bet again. I overbet the pot with about, I would say 150% total is my bet size here. And yeah, now something interesting is going to happen. He decides to re-raise me, and looking back at this hand, this should have been a warning raise. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that when somebody re-raises you, they are never bluffing. But at these lower limits, people tend to be really passive. So if they start to re-raise you, that should be a warning signal. Now, at the time, I remember I was a little, I don't know why, a little angry for some reason. And I decided, you know what? He's a bad player. He's never going to have anything that beats my ace jack. So I rip it in. He makes the call with a little bit that he still has left behind. And now we are going to see what's going to happen. The river is a king, and my first thought was, oh man, if he has king jack, I'm going to lose it, which he did not have. He had something way better. He had 9-3 suited. Now, I don't necessarily think that his call pre-flop with 9-3 suited in the big blind is super, super terrible. Yes, I personally would not call with a hand like 9-3 suited, but given the fact that he is just a recreational player and he only has to call about 30 cents more, I can see why he's calling and making a call. Now, on the flop, he made that call when I overbetted the pot with just his bottom pair. He, on the turn, got lucky, and yeah, that resulted in us getting the money in the middle. Now, looking back at this hand, yeah, maybe I should have listened to that warning signal. When passive players turn into aggressive ones, they typically have it, and therefore I should have maybe let go of my hand since it wasn't going to be strong enough. That is not because I'm results oriented. It is just because that re-raise was quite massive. He hadn't done a lot of re-raises, and therefore it's probably better to have a stronger holding than just the top pair. Now, yeah, of course, he could have done this with king jack as well, but probably if he had a hand like king jack or queen jack, he would have probably just called. So, lesson learned, on to the next one. All right, guys, we already got to the last hand. I hope you like it so far. This last hand is not a particularly massive hand or very big. It is just a fun hand that I wanted to share to show the potential that there is still at these lower limits. There is money to be made because of the things that people do, and I'm going to walk you guys through this hand. So we have ace king in the big blind, and this time a short stack player, so a player that isn't playing with 100 big blinds, he decides to put in the raise, and it gets to us. Now here we have the option between calling and raising, and so we decided, obviously with a hand as strong as ace king, to go and 3-bet that hand. We make it quite large. He decides to call us, and now there's only $5.60 in the pot, and he has $7.58 behind. So if we bet small, the chances is that he is just going to come over the top, and we have to maybe even fold a hand as strong as ace king. So I decide to put some extra pressure on him. There's still a lot of hands that I have beat. I can also sometimes see him call with crazy hands, and therefore we're just going to put it all in the middle, and we're going to put him all in. Maybe giving him a tough decision with some of his, well, already maybe better hands, or a hand like, for example, pocket sevens or something like that, where we are now slightly behind against him. So here we go. He decides to make the call, and this is where it gets fun, people. At GG Poker, you have the option, once all the money goes in the middle and there is still cards to come out, if you want to run it once, you want to run it twice, or you want to run it 3 times. Now, that means that the remaining cards are going to come however many times you decided on. And typically, I always ask to run it twice if whenever, actually. I just decide to run it twice. I think it is going to, at the end of the day, maybe cut some of the variance that we face as poker players. So I ask him to run it twice. He says, hell no. And we are going to get the money in the middle. Now, as you're going to see, the turn has the 10 and then the 7. And I already knew at that time that I was just a little bit ahead of him. But he decides to only let us run it once. And yeah, guess what happens? He hits that 10 on the turn. So he ships this spot. Unfortunate for us. We had the best hand going in, but that happens some of the times. Can't help it. Okay guys, that was it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed reviewing some of these hands together at the lower limits. Now, like I said, over the past week, I didn't really play as much as I wanted to, but we will try and be better and get better. Now, we ended up playing a total of 5 hours and a little bit of change. And here it goes. Are you ready? We had a positive result of $9.73. Well, it isn't what we maybe wanted to, but it is a positive result. We're not losing and we're slowly building that bankroll. So on to the next one. What's coming up next? Well, I'm going to prepare a lot for live poker. Next week, the Utrecht Poker Series are starting in Holland Casino in, well, obviously Utrecht, and I'm going to try and prepare as much as I can. I'm going to study. I'm going to make sure my lifestyle is on point. I'm going to switch my study a little bit more to have a live focus. And of course, we are hopefully going to shoot some footage there to take you guys with us on the journey. Now, if you watched this episode and you've made it so far, I would really, really, really appreciate your feedback. Please let me know what you thought of this episode as I'm just starting out. Do you like this format? Do you think it's too long? Do you think it's too short? Do you think we should do it more often? Any and everything is welcome, including feedback on the hands that I showed you guys. So, hey, if you want to join the 9 people that I convinced to become a subscriber since my first vlog, please feel free to do so. Hit the like and subscribe buttons, and I see you guys soon.